Hi guys, today I'm going to be talking to you about 17th century education. Um, in the early 17th century, the Pilgrims came in 1620. They landed in Cape Cod, Massachusetts, actually where I'm from. Of course, there were children on the Mayflower, and they would need an education. So this kind of began the process of educating these students, and uh, brought to light the need for academics because there were now students. Granted, the Native Americans were already here, but the English brought over this idea of establishing an education for their children. So basically, how schooling began, there weren't really that many buildings specifically for educating. So therefore, it was up to the community to supply the needs that a school would have, including the finances. For example, construction of those buildings and as well as teacher salaries. So it was very different than it is today, where it's kind of up to the community to provide their own needs so that the needs of their children are met. As it was, students were hard to find in the sense that because of the time frame that they were in, um, these students were needed to work in the fields, they were needed to work in the homes, they were needed to help with the other children, and just be a helping hand. They weren't really expected to be in an education because the Pilgrims had just come, and there was a lot that needed to be done. So getting parents to agree to allow their child out of work for a whole day was very difficult. I mean, if you think about it, it's school is about seven-ish, 8 hours, but in total, from the time you wake up, you get dressed, you walk out the door, you drive to school, you sit through school, and then you get picked up and then driven home, and then there's homework. Granted, I guarantee you their homework wasn't as difficult as ours was. As a matter of fact, I'll be talking about how they went about schoolwork later. But that whole time frame took away from them working in the fields or preparing dinner, stuff like that. That was much needed. If there was no building, if there was no money, then they taught at home. Due to the need for help within the home, many children were not allowed to leave and attend school. So parents saw that education and academics were still important, which was great because they are. And therefore, they decided, well, hey, if our finances aren't going to help us out with sending our child to school, then we will gladly teach them at home. Yet another sacrifice, though, because therefore, normally it was the mother who taught, and she would have to take time out of her day from cooking meals and also working in the field. So either way, they were kind of losing that work that they had prior to an education. Um, so basically, at this point, parents began to realize that it was important for their child to have an education for their future. So, for example, if one of the younger boys in their family was going to inherit the business or the farm that the father was going to have, specifically business related, he would need an education because handling the money and handling stuff like that, money, you need math. You also need social skills, so including reading and writing, that definitely helps with your speech and it helps with your vocabulary. It is common knowledge that the more you read, the larger your vocabulary is going to be. And so, therefore, these parents started to realize, hey, it's very important that our kids have an education. And so they decided to take matters into their own hands if they weren't provided that free education and teach on their own. Now, we're going to transition into reading and writing, but I'm going to describe one item that they used as a teaching aid for these students to learn how to read, and in turn they would learn how to write following that. It is called a horn book, and there should be a picture coming up in a second, but it is a teaching aid consisting of a leaf of paper showing the alphabet, often the 10 digits and also the Lord's Prayer. And it was on a wooden tablet protected by a thin plate of horn. And so it's like a box, kind of like a square rectangle, and then it has kind of like a handle on the bottom. And so this was their means of learning how to read and write. Again, completely different from where we are now. I mean, just crazy. We have phones now. So reading. After using the hornbook for the alphabet, students would be required to know their ABCs back and forth before moving on to the next step. To learn the alphabet, many teachers would offer a reward. As a matter of fact, back in the 17th century, sometimes they would make the hornbooks out of food. And one example that was given was making the hornbook out of gingerbread. And so every time a student would get a letter right, they would eat the gingerbread. So it made it enjoyable for the students to learn. It made it easy for them to grasp that knowledge by having something tangible to use. As well, students began to read syllable by syllable. So as soon as they understood their alphabet, they began with reading the first syllable, and then the second and the third, and then until the word was done. So for example, they would read eat or yummy or photograph. And those words each have a different amount of syllables, but they would break it up. So for eat, it would just be eat. For yummy, it would be yum, and then e, yummy. And then photograph, it would be photograph. When syllables were mastered, students then moved on to sentences with just one syllable words. So for example, I ate a bag of chips. Each of those words has one syllable, and so students would repeat sentences as such that only had one syllable for the sole purpose of just having it simplified, and therefore they could soon enough break into sentences with multiple syllables. Alrighty, on to writing. Not very many students actually continue to the writing stage. So as soon as they used the hornbook and they learned how to read syllable by syllable and sentences, that was kind of all they wanted, kind of all that they thought they needed. Granted, we know more to that extent that writing is definitely important, but these students believed, well, if I can read, I can talk. And so that was kind of what they were wanting out of this. So not very many students continue to this stage. To write, students had to make their own pens and ink, and they needed to prepare the paper to write on. So pens and ink, that was on their own time, as well as creating the paper. So this was also going back to taking time away from being in the fields or being in the home working. This was also going to take a lot of their time because they had to prepare just for one writing session. So if you think about today, we have multiple pieces of paper where we just kind of flip around and we write all over them, and just like this is just my agenda. But we have all of these pieces of paper, and just one piece of paper for them took them a lot of time to create. I mean, you think about it, and we have machines nowadays that create paper for us. We don't have to do that on our own, and we just go up to the teacher and say, hey, can I have another piece of paper? I need to write a math problem, or I need to jot some notes down. But for these students, they had to prepare that on their own. So writing did take a toll on their living situation, as well as just their time. And then the types of common writing. So italics and secretary. Italics was known to be quicker to learn and to write. Italics is a form of, I would consider it in between like our basic writing skills and cursive. So it's kind of a more elegant type of writing. And then for that reason, it is very quick to write. So if you've ever written in cursive, you know that it is quick to write. Granted, as soon as you begin writing cursive, it takes you a while because you have to get used to the letters. And that's the same for italics. There is a certain way of writing in italics. Actually, in my 3rd grade class, I was required to write in italics. And technically it was for the whole school, but I was only there for a year. So italics does take a lot of practice. Just as children, we wrote in those lined papers with the bold line and the dotted line and the bold line, and you'd have to meet each standard of where to write the letter. That was expected for italics. So then if you think about that on top of creating the paper, it took a lot of time because just to practice writing in italics and also secretary, it was using paper that they had so diligently worked to create just so they could end up throwing it away because they were just practicing their letters on it. So that definitely took a toll on these students. So for example, you have a family who lives out on the prairie or something like that, I don't know. And they have a father and a mother, and they have an older brother, and then a sister, and then 2 boys, and then a baby sister on the way. This family situation would probably look like schooling from the home, so homeschooling that we would call it today, because of the amount of kids. But as soon as that baby girl comes along, it's going to change everything because what is the mom going to do? How is she going to care for 5 children, including an infant? And so you might find that the older brother stops school altogether, even possibly the older sister. Eventually, she might end up starting to teach the 2 younger brothers. So these situations can vary, but in the 17th century, it was completely flip-flopped of what we have today, of course, because it's a completely different century. But the changes they had to make and the changes that have been made and the way education and academics has been modified since the 17th century is so drastic. You just think about the Horn Book, and it's a wooden tablet type thing where you just have your ABCs and the Lord's Prayer and 10 digits, and that's how they learned how to do their alphabet. So thank you for listening to this video. I hope it helped you understand what 17th century education was like. If you have any questions, feel free to email me. My email is laurenvsmith@tfc.edu. Alrighty, bye.